thing about gamers is we know what it feels like to be judged as low status by the mainstream culture, regardless of the political temperature of the time. I mean, I remember back in the 90s when it was the evangelical conservative Christians who were railing against gaming for being too violent, too addictive, and of course you had a lot of these conservative talking heads who took this argument all the way to Congress. It was very visible. The news was covering this hysteria with video games like Doom releasing, and due to the ultra-violent occult imagery and subject matter, there was kind of this hysterical conservative backlash against games. And these are boomers, they didn't understand the culture at all. But it wasn't too long before, by the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, post 9/11 and at the start of the Bush era, things became a lot more anti-establishment. It was very trendy to hate on neoconservatives and this interventionalist Bush doctrine that really turned a lot of normies against America, against American conservatism. And consequently, the pop culture of this era had a distinctly liberal, centrist, libertarian flavor to it, resonating with the youth in a big way. Anti-war, anti-censorship, pro-free speech, and of course, during this pre-2008, pre-Obama era, still a time of relative low status for the gamer, himself being perceived as some form of nerd by the women of society and wider culture. The gamer wasn't openly loathed by the tastemakers and cultural critics of the time, simply just sneered at, tolerated. But in keeping with the zeitgeist, millennial normies became quite comfortable with this fight the power, but in a kind of hot topic, safe, edgy, sanitized, kind of unserious manner that, of course, we have the right politics. We're the new generation. We're millennials. We're anti-war. Fuck Bush. Cynical, sarcastic, postmodern slackers that nonetheless just want everybody to get along. Because that's all it takes to be a good person. You just buy the new Green Day album, which is presented as an anti-establishment screed against American imperialism, quote unquote. Of course, with various rock stars and celebrities all feeling quite comfortable to chime in and amplify this anti-interventionalist message, this populist call for peace, which, despite being presented as somewhat edgy in its clapping back against Western governments and their escapades in the Middle East, these opinions were still fashionable. It had never been easier to achieve this coveted status of rebellion, of being a noble outsider willing to speak truth to power, without really having to risk anything personally yourself. The stakes were low. As for the culture war, this was still a time of relative peace. The gamer himself, although vaguely liberal, vaguely anti-war, still had his own culture to immerse himself in. Not only the video game industry in its prime, but the young white male could immerse himself in his own countercultural music, his own countercultural fashion. Even our women dressed a certain way. We had something into which we could retreat when the mainstream culture itself became unpalatable. For me, the rise of rap music at the time was something that just didn't appeal to me in its mainstream, ubiquitous form. So I found my culture within nu metal, emo, screamo, scene. These implicitly white subcultures that may seem cringe by today's standards, but nonetheless acted as something of a refuge for the increasingly alienated young male gamer of that period. And it's sad to see how much of this grassroots culture we've lost over the years. But of course, things were really only just heating up. And in fact, if you want to understand our contemporary period of extreme political polarization, you need to understand the atmosphere of the culture when Obama was elected in 2008. Because something weird was going on during this period. I remember it very distinctly because, of course, Obama descended onto the American political scene from nowhere, almost like he was grown in a petri dish at some kind of CIA-sponsored black site lab. The perfect Democrat candidate, the perfect politician for America at the time, really. This Christ-like figure representing the ultimate victory of liberalism. The Death Star has exploded, the Ewoks are dancing around, Voldemort has been slain, the credits are about to roll. John Williams' score swells to this climax, and all of the millennial libtards and comped celebrities breathed this collective sigh of relief as they put down their metaphorical rifles and settled into the end of history in earnest. This was the victory of the American and Western liberal left, wrought eternal, just as prophesied by the post-World War II neoliberal philosophers like Karl Popper and Francis Fukuyama, that we've solved all the problems of industrial society, that racism will cease to exist from this point onward. We will all join as one and start dancing around singing Kumbaya, Kumbaya, my lord. The Western culture war being waged low-key in the background of society ever since the 60s, it's now been won, with a total victory for the left. And onward now to utopia. This is kind of how election night felt for a lot of people, as this symbolic refutation of all of the negative characteristics of the American identity, the racism, the petty nationalism, the jingoism. Everyone's dancing. Darth Vader is finally defeated or whatever. And I turn around to this guy next to me, a fellow American expat at the time, and I said, is this guy really for real? Is he really going to close down Guantanamo Bay? Is he really going to cure cancer? Obama promised to cure cancer, by the way, during his campaign. And he goes, of course he is, of course. Hey, don't be cynical, celebrate the evening or whatever. But I remember thinking right then and there, I hope this guy's legit. I hope he's for real, because wouldn't it be disappointing to find out that Obama is just another American politician, and in fact, his loyalties do not lie with the American people, and in fact, his administration may be worthy of criticism in the same way that the Bush regime was? Well, it's funny because everybody I knew loved Obama. Everybody in the UK worshipped Obama. He could do no wrong. Almost as a saint of neoliberalism, he was beyond reproach. To even mildly criticize this politician in libtard circles would out you as some form of racist. It really was political carte blanche for the incoming administration. A strange period culturally, in that the left's victory was so absolute, it was almost this Pax Obama. To be a Republican, to be a conservative during this period was to be profoundly uncool. And so mass society kind of settled into this Obama-era politically correct lethargy, as if the culture itself, having run out of steam after counter-signaling the Bush regime for so many years, now found itself rudderless. As if this cult-like unwavering support for Obama had cost the normie libtard a piece of his soul on some level. And it's this cloying dullness of the Obama era. You can see it when you watch an episode of The Office and observe the character of Jim Halpert, the unserious, uninspired normie liberal, just going through the motions, getting up in the morning, going to his boring-ass job, pedestalizing the painfully mid, barely fuckable Karen at reception. Hey, how relatable. Life is pretty dull at the end of history, with no more wars to fight, no grand conquests to partake in. And with all the problems of American society solved now that we have a black president, nothing to do but put our feet up and enjoy this 1,000-year Reich of progressive liberalism. And I can hear Republicans complaining somewhere, but I don't care. Because I'm in power. This is my world now. It's true that politics is downstream from culture. First we won the culture, now we've won politics. My victory will stretch on through the ages as the one true, perfect, eternal social construct, standing immovable, immutable, unchangeable, the only true object of permanence in this godless, chaotic universe. The Obama era broke the left in some very bizarre ways, as they shifted from fighting the power to allying publicly with the state power and becoming enforcers of the regime, of its ideology, of its culture. And this is kind of the foundations for what we now refer to as wokeism being laid, the seeds planted in the public consciousness, as Obama himself introduced a lot of distinctly neo-Marxist rhetoric into the national conversation, with trans rights being, in retrospect, a rather conspicuous part of his agenda. The media and the ex-anti-establishment left coddling him at every turn, and for mass society itself to turn its back on counterculture because counterculture is no longer necessary. This was the point of no return for a lot of leftoids, in my opinion. They sold their souls so they could keep living in that fantasy. That warm, cozy fantasy where I'm the good guy, I voted for the good guy, I'm the reason why the world is saved. There's this narcissism, there's this arrogance that is almost self-perpetuating, and it just keeps on escalating and accelerating. How could it not? How could the narcissist turn their beam of critique and of judgment back on themselves and admit, okay, maybe I got a little bit carried away there. God forbid, maybe. Perhaps I was wrong about some things. Perhaps I need to go back into a state of deep analysis and question some of my core beliefs, even if it results in a loss of social status. Well, that is simply unacceptable, like on an existential level, lest that sublime social status become tarnished even slightly. Unlike the lowly gamer who is comfortable paying that tax on his social status just so he can play based Ludo at his own leisure, to the normgroid, to the leftoid, to the NPC shitlib, social status is everything. It's life. That feeling of validation is something that you would kill to defend. And anyone that would threaten to even question the legitimacy of your power is an enemy. And it's interesting to note that right now, even on the right, not only do mainstream conservatives have an extremely low opinion of gaming as a pastime, but even on the dissident right, there is this disdain for the gamer and his culture. And to be clear, I'm not defending the trends of endless grind and monetization and woke neo-Marxist propaganda that infects contemporary gaming, but to the Apollonian Ubermensch that comprise this dissident reactionary right wing online, my advice is, guys, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the fact is, video games are a real medium of culture, to be recaptured, to be built upon, to become a vessel for the creation of new counterculture. In that the true spirit of gaming is not woke, and in fact is so inherently based, it gave a generation of men the tools to resist a very ugly period of domestic tyranny and authoritarianism that's still ongoing to this day. But the true culture of gaming, to be dumped on from the left, from the right, from the up, from the down, sorry, Bronze Age Nietzscheans, instead of fighting the culture war before any of you fucking posers, I should have been sunning my balls and lifting and reading obscure 20th century right-wing philosophy and sharing pictures of my physique for other men to enjoy online. This is the way. No, because Gamergate really was the inflection point, the drawing of first blood when it comes to the modern incarnation of the culture war in all of its hatred and venom and resentment and bitterness that those publicly and professionally on the left during this mid-2010s period were provoked by gamers into going mask off, and they have been mask off ever since. Watching these people abuse their power, abuse the system so hard in their favor because they held power, with literally no regard for the humanity of people who don't agree with them. It was truly something I'd never experienced before. And this dynamic just keeps getting worse and worse. As if in the latter stages of the Obama era, there was this psychic dissonance just festering away in the minds of these supposedly benevolent leftoids, that their power perhaps wasn't as secure as they'd always thought. When first the gamer rose up to challenge the cultural legitimacy of this regime, so too would Donald Trump and his movement rise to power, challenging the culture of politics in America. Making use of that same reactionary countercultural energy that fueled Gamergate, a lot of young men became red-pilled, comparing the behavior of the video game journalists with the blatant subversion coming from the mainstream media. It almost seemed like the institution of journalism itself had been exposed as inherently subversive for all to see. As not just the journalists, but the entire regime, including Trump's own supposed allies within the GOP, formed this phalanx of resistance. His ability to deliver on even the most basic promises of his campaign neutered in an instant. As if the media should hold this much sway over the minds of the NPCs in a so-called democracy. They are being programmed to hate. They are being rallied to war. And as for Trump, a lot's been said about the man. It looks like he's guaranteed to win in November. I'm not saying I love his current administration, not a fan of the interventionist Zionists making a return. But at this point, I feel like Trump is bigger than himself, just this human being. He's become a charged icon, a countercultural totem, if you will. And this phenomenon of TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, that seems to afflict so many people within our society, people who claim to be sane, rational, compassionate human beings, well, in the next breath, they're calling for violence against not only President Trump himself, but his supporters, innocent people that just have a different vision for America. Is that really such a terrible thing? Really? It's the same type of psychopathy that woke game developers and journalists express on a daily basis. It's this constantly escalating intolerance for people with heterodox beliefs and values. With prominent figures on the left continuing to ratchet up the violent rhetoric, the post-Trump apocalyptic rhetoric, incredibly irresponsible, incredibly unethical journalistically. I mean, you know how we Gamergaters are, right? Like, we held Zoe Quinn to a high standard, which apparently unintentionally triggered the fall of Western civilization. Flash forward a decade and Trump was almost assassinated. The left are disappointed. Hollywood is disappointed. Celebrities are lamenting the fact that our president wasn't fucking killed on live TV. His head exploded in 4K. Slowly and incrementally, we got to this point, like frogs being boiled, where the normgroid has been so demoralized in that exact same fashion described by Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet defector, that they're simply unreachable through reason, through truth. They are disconnected from reality, totally radicalized, totally willing to actually kill their enemies, an enemy which has been created out of their own neuroses. It's like a complete phantasm, which nonetheless is being projected onto ordinary people, ordinary conservatives, regular people like me and you. Simply the progression of Trump-era cancel culture. It's evolved into this idea that you should have your entire fucking life canceled. You should be canceled from the face of the earth. And so the conversation on the right goes as follows. Should we, as victims of this tyrannical cancel culture over the last 8 years, nonetheless utilize said cancel culture to strike back against people who are calling for our fucking murder in the streets? And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, Destiny, the popular liberal cuckold streamer, is publicly calling for violence against ordinary Trump supporters. It's absurd how unhinged some of these people have become. Like, we have to share a society with these absolute freaks after they've destroyed countless lives and careers, all for fucking nothing, only to become openly genocidal. Like, you know what? We need to cancel Destiny like an Elder Scrolls 6 pre-order.